start with kind of a quick little introduction of who I am and what we do here at Reviewr. 'Cause I do think it kind of helps set the stage a bit for, kind of today's goals and agenda and kind of why we have the topic we do. So, quick introduction. My name is Kyle. I'm the CEO here at Reviewr. Been doing this since virtually day one back in 2012. I think we're kind of unique in the sense that our team built Reviewr kind of for the people, by the people, with very firsthand experience. So we have a pretty deep background in funding opportunities, so scholarships, grants, investments, specifically from the review team's perspective. So we served on volunteer boards, and back in 2012, if you can kind of even fathom what this would look like, most of these grants were done through physical paper. So we had hundreds and hundreds of binders being mailed to us, and we were tasked with handwriting notes and feedback and scores and either mailing it back or meet in person on the weekend with other committee members. And we kind of go through this process over and over until ultimately we had recipients selected. And so we kind of started to see firsthand, operationally speaking, the many, many moving parts and components that go into a grant process specifically. Again, if those of you on the call today are also doing things like scholarships within your foundations, very, very similar workflows. And we saw some of the negative impacts that started to come into play. Specifically speaking, though, this was kind of as organizations attempted to go online, right? So the adoption of technology actually made things, I think, more negative for us as a review committee member, because at least with the paper and the binders that were centralized, now we're using like 8 different tools, emails and spreadsheets, and we're downloading of documents. We're going to Google Drive, we're going to Microsoft Access. And none of these tools obviously are built for the task at hand, which meant that it made some things obviously easier, specifically from like an applicant's perspective. But then it had a whole bunch of kind of downstream negative ramifications. Very specifically, we started to see two really problematic things happen. So, from a submission perspective, for those of you that were collecting applications through emails and downloading of documents and merging, two things happened. Number one is some of them went to spam filters. And so teams actually sat down and they awarded grant funds to find out months later that there were applicants that didn't even get included in the initial selection, right? So extremely problematic from a mission-driven organization perspective. Number two, and kind of on that same note, though, is you start to see kind of like the ongoing data collection from the grantees. So the grant reporting templates or their file uploads that would come in throughout the course of a year or disconnected or disjointed that started to get lost, right? And operationally speaking, it makes sense. You have to download, export, recompile. And so again, that was quite problematic. We also saw, again, this is from our own kind of personal experience, very clear biases being put forth from review teams. The way that these review and selection processes were being structured, either from like an operation perspective or also like with a lack of redaction of PII or personal identifying information, led evaluators or committee members to obviously make very biased selections, either about who the people were that they knew, demographic details, all these things that are very hard to talk about. So it was these experiences that led us to build Reviewr's kind of two main goals. One, like operationally speaking, how do we streamline your daily lives, right? Make things more efficient. But number two is you actually make up a very small fraction of the program, right? The applicants, the board members, the volunteers. And so how do we just overarching elevate their experience and provide them kind of the engagement that they deserve with these types of campaigns? So that was what kind of led us to build Reviewr at this point in time. We do thousands of these campaigns every single year from all walks of life. Now, the reason why I wanted to start with that introduction, and I think why it's relevant to today's conversation, is over the years, we've seen so many unique processes, some really, really great, and some maybe less so. And so part of our onboarding implementation process at Reviewr is not only taking your current process and structure, kind of where you want to go moving forward, loading it into the system, but also kind of deep diving into not just the features we have, but like what emerging trends and best practices and things that we're seeing with thousands and thousands of these campaigns in a calendar year. Can we kind of make maybe recommendations or kind of help bring light to? Because at the end of the day, we're all mission-driven organizations, and obviously the platform will do exactly what I say it's going to do. It's going to power these campaigns. But I think much bigger and much more important is how do we kind of take the space and take it to the next level in order for us to impact more people's lives. That's ultimately what our mission and vision here is at Reviewr. And so in recent conversation, we started to hear from these organizations that they were looking to revamp their grant process very specifically, not just on how they collect applications, but how they do the review process. I think historically speaking, maybe we tend to overcomplicate things. They're looking at how do they lower the barrier from an applicant's perspective, but also at the same time collect the essential information that they need from the applicants to make informed decision processes off of. And then again, as compliance and data security and PII becomes a big big talking point. And obviously, I just got a message here a little bit ago about a data breach, right, from Apple News, that's at the forefront of everybody's mind, right? So how do they be sensitive of some of that type of stuff? And so that's kind of what led us to kind of take a look at our portfolio of companies. And we looked at one that I think has a really well-structured grant process that I want to kind of walk through in real time with you guys today and kind of talk about the ideas behind why they structured the way that they did, but then also kind of actually physically interact with it and kind of view in practicality how that could be applied to some of your programs. So with all that said, I am going to jump into kind of a screen share here. And we're going to look at both kind of this kind of high level framework, but then I'm going to spend the most of my time here in Reviewr, not necessarily to show you the power of the platform, but more so to visualize these topics, right, in a way that makes more sense. So again, on the application side of things, like there are life-changing opportunities for many of these organizations. And from a grant making perspective, you probably fall into two different kind of worlds. One is you're, providing individual grants to people, maybe people of need, or it's organizational grants, right, to either nonprofits or mission-driven organizations. And so, how do you kind of equip them for success to tell you their story on why they need funds, what they're going to utilize it for, in a way that lowers the barrier for them? They have to stay hyper focused on creating the best version of themselves in a way that they can position themselves for obviously funding success and not being kind of bogged down into the technical difficulties or challenges and actually trying to submit. And it seems like a very simple thing, but there's a lot of organizations and a lot of applicants who actually get deterred from programming because there's too strict of a barrier to even participate, right? Like the downloading of web forms and going in and filling out fillable PDFs and spreadsheets and have to attach it, email back to you. Like there's a pretty dramatic, roughly 30% drop off rate, right, with those types of workflows. And so, how do we put a system in place that empowers them to save, log out, come back later, and submit the deliverables that you ultimately will need from them to make these decisions off of it? While at the same time, kind of doing two other things. One is ongoing data collection from the grantees specifically, because as an operation or as an organization, you're going to have to at some point do grant reporting, right? You have to be able to show to your stakeholders and to the community that you truly are providing impact with these funds. And so we have to kind of think through like, and probably working backwards, like how do you define your program as a success? And then how do we collect that information long term from the grantees in a way that doesn't get disconnected or disjointed that you can then leverage to use to build those reports and kind of build community trust and impact within your organizations. And then the last piece to that is going to be, how do we manage file uploads? Again, if you're collecting any type of monetary information, so financial need documents, tax returns, anything from the IRS, financial statements, budgets, all that kind of fun stuff, we have to be hyper focused on document collection and management and data security and privacy. And then the last thing that we're going to look at here is going to be reference collection. Now, this is kind of a unique opportunity in the sense that this is a scholarship specific workflow that over the last probably year or so has really started to permeate into grant making. And the reason why is I think most organizations are looking for some type of personal storytelling about the grantee that's outside the box, right? So more so than just budgets and numbers and fund utilization, trying to help build like a personal narrative around them. And what better way of doing that than getting it directly from a reference? Now, if you are going to go that route, how do you A, lower the barrier for the reference, and then B, collect them in a way that actually helps provide value to both you as an organization and your grant making process? So in this example, I'm going to run through, they're doing all of these things. And I think it's a way for us to kind of visualize what that will look like. So with that said, I do want to kind of showcase at a high level kind of what Reviewr may look like for this type of program. Again, very specifically though, so you can visualize the structure of this grant application. So we're going to do two things. One is the grant application, and then two is let's just kind of role play and pretend that we are a grantee that was selected. How do you then collect ongoing data and deliverables from them for your own personal impact statements and grant reporting templates? So with that said, most of the organizations we work with actually use our main websites for the main marketing hub. Obviously, some of the grants we work with are invite only, so there's a whole different workflow for those. But generally speaking, your audience and your applicants are going to go to your websites first anyway, so we should leverage that. Dates, deadlines, eligibility criteria, put those on your website, and then put a link that says click here to apply. That link will then send them from your web presence over to Reviewr. Now, we do offer what I call landing pages that I'm not going to show you here today because, again, the goal isn't to really showcase Reviewr. It's more so workflow related. But I do like landing pages. They serve as a middleman between your process and kind of the Reviewr portal. With that said, most organizations will send people to a page like this. Now, this is a critical component that has to be considered for no matter what tools that you're using. And it's what I call a profile creation. So there are so many moving parts to a grant process, right? You've got people, submissions, and I say submissions plural because you have their initial grant application and then potentially ongoing data collection deliverables from the grantees. Some of the American Rescue Plan grants that we work with, literally for 4.5 years, every single month, the grantees come back into Reviewr and submit a grant report template. So literally once a month for 4.5 years, they're submitting ongoing deliverables. You have to be able to store that and hold on to it with all their other information and not kind of having things pieced together, living in all sorts of different places. On top of that, you've got file uploads, you've got judging and scoring, you've got communication. So the general idea behind a profile is yes, on the very front end, they just kind of create an account and then it drops them into the submission process. But long term, ongoing, it basically holds on to all of their deliverables or activities into one centralized hub. It's also critical from like an audit perspective that you have kind of that paper trail and that kind of online reporting perspective where all the activities still kind of live on in a way that's digestible. So with that said, the first thing I want to look at, again, all the information in here has been redacted. It's a real grant application using kind of fake names at this point, is a grant eligibility. So it seems like a very, very small thing, but for any of you on this call who have multiple grant opportunities and or very, very, very specific grant criteria, the idea behind lowering the barrier for applicants is twofold. So number one is that we want to make sure that they, answer a series of questions. And then based off of their responses, the system will literally say, hey, you're eligible or you're not. And again, it seems like a small thing, but from a user experience, we don't want to waste people's hard time and value filling things out that they just don't have a chance for. Two is operationally speaking, it also helps you kind of vet through people automatically. So you're not wasting your time kind of crossing people off of a list because they didn't even meet your criteria. I think bigger picture though is if you are a grant making organization that has very, very specific funds for different things, a lot of times our general public and applicants don't even know what's available to them. So you can almost flip the switch and then in our system, the system will read and answer all these questions and say, hey, based on what you just filled out of all the grants that we offer, these are the three that best align with what you submitted. So A, you're eligible for them, and then B, you're actually, matched up with them because you have a strong chance to apply. So from here, then the applicants will do two things. Obviously, they'll select whichever all of the ones they want to apply for. They'll proceed on. But then a kind of bigger picture on the back end, we're creating these workflows for you as an operations team. So in this example, we've got three grants, the Bobby Gatsby grant, the Brooke Marlowe grant, and then the Lennox Wilder grant. Every single applicant will be kind of bucketed into whatever corresponding program that they're applying for. On top of that, it also gives you really the ability to create what I call personalized experiences. So as an applicant, I can actually display different questions to the Bobby Gatsby grant applicants than I would to the Lennox Wilder one. So powerful things going on here. Now, as far as the actual grant application structure itself goes, again, the idea is to build a narrative around the applicant that aligns with what you're looking for as a grant maker. So in this example, this grant is specifically towards nonprofits, right? So the applicant comes in, they put in who they are, they tell us more about their organization, they provide their EIN or their tax ID numbers or their nonprofit numbers. They tell us more about their organizational address. They tell us more about their mission and vision, just high level building kind of like a profile on behalf of the organization that's applying for the grant. From here, we move into what you need for grant selection, which is, hey, what are you requesting funds for? And so it kind of does go systematically through kind of a storytelling process. So it basically starts by saying, hey, tell us more about the project, right? The name of it, the summary of it. Then from there, get into more details of the project. Tell us more about how this project aligns with the mission and vision of our grant making organization, right? You have a very unique mission driven value system. You need to ensure that the grantees align with that. So the idea is hopefully the applicants have an understanding of you and your organization and then kind of putting the pressure on them to build a story around, hey, here's what I need the funds for, here's what my project is, but also here's how it aligns with you as a grant maker. From there, we start to get more into funding. So obviously upload a budget. we'll kind of come back to this here in a little bit. I do love uploads and files just because, you can build tables into these systems, but actually having real, spreadsheets and file uploads is the best way to collect robust data. Again, how do you store that in a safe, secure manner? And then B, how do you give that to your review team is really where the challenges get presented. So we're going to kind of come back to that here in a bit. Tells us a little bit more about like what the funding is actually needed for. So this is primarily things like expenses and what you're going to use it for, usage of grant funds. And then I think the two most important aspects to this program is two things. One is how do you define success, right? You're coming to us, you're requesting funding for some big project. How at the end of the day are you going to be able to define success internally? This is some foreshadowing because this is also what's going to ideally power your grant reporting template because you as an organization also need to report back on how do you define success, and there needs to be alignment there. So you ask the applicant, how are you going to define success? What are the metrics, right? And then at some point they're going to report back to you. Are they on or off track? What are those metrics? How off were they? What are they going to do to course correct? Things like that. But you really can't put that pressure and that emphasis on it without collecting on the front end, right? So it's kind of setting expectations. And then the last piece to this is more so sustainability. And so you can look at this a couple different ways. The way that I kind of read through this is like long term, like how sustainable is this grant, right? So once you get funded, are you going to need additional funding in the future? Is it going to be self-sustainable? What are your plans to make it self-sustainable so that we don't just fund a project that dies in 5 years, right? So again, it seems short, simple, and sweet, and it is in a good way. We're collecting only the real roots and essentials. And I think that oftentimes we as organizations will over complex these submission processes by collecting a whole bunch of metrics and variables and things that just we don't need, right? You have a mission and you have a vision. You're providing grant funding to other individuals who also have mission vision. Like do their mission and vision align with you as an organization? Two, what is their project and what impact are they trying to have? And then three, how can they prove to you that they're going to be able to measure success and then make that a sustainable project long term? That's it. That is at its core what we need to collect. Now, in this example, they do start to collect some additional information. This is mostly from record keeping purposes. So they are collecting additional file uploads, so financial statements, project plans, whatever other deliverables that might be helpful to make a case on behalf of the applicant. And then from there, they get into more like, I'm going to come back to references here in a second. They get into things like board of directors, other grants that they've received in the past, any other supporting material, just kind of, again, record keeping purposes to learn more about the organization. Now, I mentioned the references. So again, this is a very, very common workflow in scholarships that has permeated into grants. And so just to kind of talk a little bit about this, and I'll show this to you, is how do you actually do it? So again, the idea behind a reference or a letter of recommendation is to have somebody else help build a case on behalf of the grantee that's not them. The problem, and this is relevant to all programs, is I hate reference letters. They're overly complex. They're being asked at the very last minute. The person writing the reference is typically going to either A, repurpose a template that they've used in the past, or they're going to rush through it. It's just the way that they are. And so oftentimes it becomes more of a reflection of the person writing the reference and less so about who it's for. So instead, what I would prefer to see in what we do here at Reviewr is the applicant simply puts in who their reference is. That's it. And then they in itself will get an email saying, hey, David, you've been asked to write a reference on behalf of Reviewr who's applying to this year's Empower Tomorrow grant. Click here to do so. They then would click on the link. And then instead of uploading a reference letter, you ask them to answer 3 to 5 questions. That's it. What are the 3 to 5 things that you want that reference to talk about that's going to help you as a grant making organization build a better picture about the grantee? So it lowers the barrier dramatically from the reference. They just answer a series of questions. They can save, they can log out, they can come back later. And then from a compliance perspective, when you and your team go to sit down and conduct reviews, you now are comparing apples to apples, right? Every single grantee has the same kind of corresponding data associated with them. So again, seems like small things, but they're really, really impactful in the grand scheme of things. So applicants come in, they go through the process. Now, again, I mentioned beforehand that I want to kind of jump the gun a bit and say, okay, well, what happens in this example if this person got selected for a grant, right? We have a really great way of collecting grant applications. We'll get more into like workflows, again, of how you select the proper recipients. But now their journey doesn't end. You need additional deliverables from the grantee. So in Reviewr, this kind of goes back to that concept of profiles that I mentioned earlier on, is when the applicant logs back into their account, they then land on their own personal profile. So here's me, Michael, I'm the grant applicant. This is all the information that I submitted to you. Now, again, this is kind of mocked up for today's conversation. Obviously from an applicant's perspective, they can make updates or edits to their profile if you allow them to do so. What is nice, however, is that you can actually directly communicate with them. So if you ever have to send them messages or ask additional deliverables or tax return, whatever it might be, you can just simply message them in the system. They get a notification. They can come back. They can see that message. They can add it to their profile. So it allows you to, again, not to worry about them submitting a bunch of emails to you and sending off a bunch of additional attachments that you then have to reconnect back to their initial form. It just kind of lives together inside Reviewr. Now, again, what I want to show you, however, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Obviously, you have all of your file uploads, which I'm going to come back to, which do get embedded into the system, is what I call supplemental forms. So again, let's just role play here. Let's pretend that Michael, 6 months from now, needs to come in and submit a grant reporting template. All Michael simply needs to do is come into Reviewr, click Add New, and then from there, Michael will just pick what is it that they're trying to add. The reason why this is important is you might have multiple different types of grant reporting templates you need from them. Again, going back to like the American Rescue Plan, they literally have 12. It says January reporting template, February reporting template, all the way through December. And so the grantee simply clicks on the name of the form, they press select, and then from here, they literally will fill it out right in Reviewr. So again, the reason why I love this example is all the content that they're submitting at this point maps directly back to the initial application. So again, a lot of this can get pre-populated, right? So like their organization name, their EIN, we already know what that is. We already know their project plan, their title, the amount that they received, the dates and deadlines. And then it gets into like, what was the initial stated goal of your application? And then what was the actual outcome? Again, I can't overemphasize like how simple this seems, but how impactful it is. You said you were going to do something. Did you do it or not? And if not, what's the plan moving forward? And this, it's not a bad thing. We just need to be able to course correct. So applicants, again, what was the initial goal? What was the actual outcome? Tell us more about why there was a discrepancy between the actual outcome versus the stated goals. Tell us more about, again, you told us earlier on that you had a plan in place to measure success. What were those metrics and did you hit them? And if not, what was the discrepancy? Tell us more about the impact of the grant or of the program. Tell us more about the actual expenditures in comparison to what you requested. Tell us more about your key successes, what went well, what didn't go well. That can be used for marketing purposes as well as for data tracking and reporting. Tell us more about long term, like do you need additional funds? What's the next phase of this? Like what are your updates to your plan? And then again, when you go to build your own internal grant impact statements and reports, you're pulling data directly from this. So here's all of the grantee information. Here's what we funded. Here's why we funded it. And here's kind of where all that current data lives. Here's the impact that they've had, right? The only way you can get to that point is to be able to collect the information as you go. So again, just kind of simplifying things here. When you go to do grant reporting templates, what do you want to report back on? And just make the assurance that throughout the course of your campaign, you're collecting those milestones from the applicants. Otherwise, you're going to be scrambling to get that in the future. So with all that said, we kind of ran through the application side of things. The next thing I want to get into is kind of two things. I'm going to kind of skip ahead a little bit for ample time for Q&A, is how do you access those deliverables? And then number two is probably, if not equally important, more important, how do you create like these review workflows that do two things? One is ensure that the applicants get the fair opportunity that they deserve. And two, operationally speaking, they're efficient because I know for a fact how complex review processes can be. Your team is tight on time. Your volunteer staff is just that. They're volunteers. They're often doing this after their children go to bed on a Wednesday night. So how do you lower the barrier for them? This may seem like a shocking statement, but on average, there's a pretty significant energy drop-off level after 15 submissions for a review person. So if you're part of a review team, after 15 grantees, your energy falls off dramatically. So if you're reviewing number 24, are you able to give that person the energy and opportunity that they deserve from you that number one got? And the answer is probably not. So with that said, we really need to think through like how do you want to structure a review process in a way that ensures that everybody gets reviewed enough times, but also you're not overwhelming your team. And so a lot of that's going to be very just specific upon like the content you're asking them to review, right? If it's a very short application form with a very simple judging criteria, yeah, you can totally have them review more than 15. If it's a 40-page grant application with a 90 question scorecard, 15 might even be on the high end, right? So the idea is to create review what I call workflows. And there's a lot of ways to do this. What I would say the most common ways are is to create kind of pods or buckets. And that's a broad statement, I understand. But the idea behind those is that you're basically going to do two things. You're going to take your pod or your bucket and you're going to fill it up with two different things. One is grant applicants, and the other is a team for review. So, how you structure your grant applicants is kind of totally up to you. What you could, in theory, do is have different buckets per grant opportunity, per phase. So phase one review, phase two review, phase three review. You could do review committees. So each committee of 5 people, right? Lots of ways to structure it. What I would then do at that point is I would lever some type of randomization. Again, this is kind of a subjective feedback from my perspective, but I like to take your grant applicants and equally and randomly assign them out to my team for selection. That way, I'm ensuring that potentially there was no biases put into play when I pair them up. Number two is I can start to create like what I call workload thresholds. So if I know for a fact that my review team shouldn't review more than 15 people, I'm just going to randomly give every reviewer no more than 15 people, right? Seems quite simple, but operationally, how do you actually do that? It's also nice again from a compliance perspective. The last thing that we're going to look at then is the redaction of data. Again, kind of a polarizing feature here. The general idea is that there's any way that a review committee member could look at somebody's application and then cloudy their judgment, then it should be redacted. So it could be personal identifying information, it could be demographic details, whatever it might be, that's kind of on you to figure out. But if there's anything in their submission process that you feel might cloudy their review judgment, just jump the gun, redact it, protect yourself. So what does this look like? So I mentioned that concept called buckets or pods. So before we kind of go there, I do want to kind of just showcase at a high level how you share content to the review team. Because again, you're not just sharing with them applications, right? Or files. You're sharing their entire narrative and their grant profile. So historically speaking, this often means that you're jumping into your databases, your form builders, your emails, and you're downloading, you're exporting, you're sending it off to your review team, you're giving them spreadsheets. They're then downloading, they're then exporting, they're sending you back a bunch of stuff. That in itself is just quite problematic for so many reasons, obviously operationally speaking, but also data security and privacy. So in a reviewer, what ends up happening is every single grantee is a profile. And you can sort and you can filter and you can find people. And when you open up their profile, I already kind of showed this, but it's going to show you all the content we collected about them. So again, this is Michael, and this is the initial grant application that Michael filled out. So I got my project summary, my project details, I got budgets, I got file uploads. I have how we're going to measure success. Everything that we collected now shows up in one centralized hub. Again, on top of that, I can either communicate directly to Michael. I could leave internal notes about this applicant. So it's a way for you and your teams to virtually collaborate. I can go to my file uploads. It literally will show me a list of every single file that was uploaded. Better yet, I don't want you to download anything. So I can press the view button, and then you're going to notice that that file upload embeds itself right on Michael's profile. So I never have to download, leave, and come back into the system. So going back to what I wanted to show you, which is those review workflows. So again, this is that bucketing system. So you can create as many buckets as you want, and you can structure this a whole lot of ways. It could be phases of review, the types of grants, whatever it might be. In this example, I've got a combination of both, right? So I've got 5 different grants as well as 3 phases of review. Phase one review, an interview phase, and then a final selection phase. So the goal here is 2 parts. Number one is you take your bucket, in this case, the Lennox Wilder grant, and I filled up with all of my Lennox Wilder grant applications. Now, again, ideally that's done automatically from their profile. And then number two is I then assign that bucket out to a pod. So whenever Simon, Paul, and Mark come into Reviewr, they're only going to have access to the Lennox Wilder grants. Now, if you want them to review multiple buckets or multiple pods, that's great. Just give them access to multiple. So it's a way for you to take, groups of people and pair them up. Now you can get a bit more fine-tuned. I mentioned the randomization earlier on. So if that is your use case, I just simply open my bucket up and then it shows me 2 different lists. One is all of my grant applicants, and then the other is my review team. from here, I can either manually pair people up or leverage automation. So you could do a couple different things. You could say, you know what, for the sake of compliance, I want to make sure that every single grantee gets looked at exactly 5 times, no more, no less. Or I might say, I want my review team to not look at more than 15 people, but no less than 10. And so you would just bulk select and then literally type those numbers in. Give every applicant to 15 reviewers, but no less than 10. And then within Reviewr, the system will equally and randomly distribute those submissions out. Now, if you want to have more manual control, or if you have to recuse somebody or make some updates to the pairings, you just override it. So in this example, I have Mark. Right now, Mark is supposed to be scoring Gabrielle, Leslie, Richard, and Sheldon. I would just unselect somebody's name and then select somebody different. So again, really powerful on a one-to-one basis, pairing people up or leveraging automation or just pools and buckets of people. So we collected the grant applications. We have now paired them up with the review team. How do you actually physically conduct a review that's fair, non-biased, and compliant? So generally speaking, a lot of organizations will deliberate, right? There's a subjective communication that your team will do and talk about. Here's my applications. Here's who we think deserves a grant. And that's totally fine. It's promoted. With that said, you should leverage some type of scorecard or raw metric to help power those discussions. And so I like scorecards and I like to make them flow with your application form. So if you go back to our example, we have project details, we've got budget, we've got how do you measure success. You should have scorecard questions that one-to-one map with those. The other thing that I would do is I would say, more times than not, scorecards are overly complex. Your review team doesn't need to be ranking them on 15 different things. You don't need a 1 through 50 score sheet. In fact, a lot of times actually assigning point values is a barrier. So judges get really bogged down like, hey, what's the difference between 16 and 17? And it seems like a small thing, but for each application that they do that for, it just adds more and more time to the review. So instead, what I would try to do is try to elicit a emotional response from your team. So again, you're asking them a series of questions. Rank this applicant on their mission. Rank this applicant on their budget. And instead of saying 6 points, 4 points, 2 points, I would say average, good, great, above average, right? So you're getting a real quick gut instinct from them. And then behind the scenes, you absolutely still have a scorecard. There's point values that assign with all of those. So much like the reference, much like the applicant, there's answering a series of questions, but then behind the scenes, you actually are getting these leaderboards being built in real time. So again, what does that look like? So within Reviewr, when the evaluation team comes in, they get a menu. And again, what they see here could be different for everybody. So if you are redacting any information, hiding data, hiding names, it won't be showing up here. But they will simply do two things. They will A, click on the name or ID of the grantee, and then B, they're presented a split screen. So you can see here off to the left side of my page, I have all the information about the grant applicant. They can look at the file uploads. Again, those all get embedded off to the left. And then off to the right is your selection tool. And again, you can kind of see here that they are supposed to align with independent scrolling. So the review team, as they scroll through the grant application, as they look at the budgets, as they look at the references, off to the right, answer a series of questions. From poor to exemplary, rank this applicants on their mission. Tell us more about their funding needs, the grant summary, the proposed budget, the long-term sustainability. And then ultimately, when they're all said and done, the system does kick out what I call a leaderboard. And so this will actually show you a list of every single applicant. It'll show you how they were scored either individually, collectively, totals, and averages. And then from here, it's presenting you and your teams the data that you need to make informed decisions. Either leverage this to power a deliberation meeting. You could actually take like your top X number of applicants and then advance them to like an interview phase or a phase 2 or a phase 3. I've seen a lot of people pull this up onto like a Zoom call or in person, and they use this to deliberate. They might say, hey, here's our top 3 grantees. Let's now talk about the results. And just because the data says this doesn't mean it has to be that way. You can rearrange stuff. The last thing I want to show you, which is kind of a bonus today, and it's kind of an emerging trend, is anytime you randomly distribute submissions to review teams, you actually self-imposed a pretty big challenge. And what that means is that not every single applicant is now being reviewed by the same people. So what happens if you have a review team or a judge, or call them whatever you want, that on average scores higher or lower than the other judges? And you can kind of see that happening here, right? So I have Sheldon, and Sheldon was scored a 12 by Mark. So then the question comes in, did Mark just score Sheldon low justifiably? Or what if Mark has never given higher than a 14? What that means is that on Mark's own personal judging, he gave him a really, really good score. However, in comparison to the other judges, it's a very, very low score, and this applicant is now being penalized for that. So we actually offer some pretty cool reporting tools that will kind of jumping the gun here, show you a list of every grantee. It shows you how each individual judge scored them. And then what you really care about is this green section. And what this is doing is it's showing you individual judging tendencies. So it actually show you that on average, Judge Judy here scores everybody about a 23.875, whereas Tony scores on average about a 34. This is real data that's been redacted. And then the question came in, why is it that every single grantee that Judge Judy scores never gets selected? And it's very, very clear and obvious because Judge Judy on average scores about 10 points lower than anybody that Tony scores. So now that we know that, what do we do? Well, you can use it to help kind of power deliberation meetings, or you start to normalize the results. And what I mean by that is you can see off to the right, we have updated metrics. And what this is basically doing is it's changing scores. So if you remember beforehand, if a judge on average scores a 24, that's now a 1. That means you were scored completely average, 100%, whatever you want to call it. You were scored average. If they scored higher than a 24, it's higher than a 1. If they scored lower than a 24, it's lower than a 1. So what you're now doing is you're taking each individual judges and you're now comparing their own personal averages against one another. And this is what your updated leaderboard will look like. You have Bruce, who is our grant recipient, who on average amongst all of the judges scores about 1.15 times higher than average. Whereas Elon here is our lowest rated candidate who scores about 0.83 times lower than average or 83%, right? So I know it's kind of a complex concept I just kind of introduced. The beauty of this is that it showcases that Reviewr has seen virtually everything. And ideally, we have features and components in a place to address them. And that way you don't need to worry about them. We kind of got your back.